Joining us from Beijing is Mr. Jia Xiudong from China's Institute of International Studies, and from Philadelphia, Professor Jacques deLisle. He specializes in East Asian studies, law, and political science. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. Let's talk about where there is common ground. Where do you see it, and how easy will it be to build on that common ground? And why don't I start with you, Mr. Jacques?
Yes, we see that many outcomes from the current strategic and economic dialogue. We saw reports of 120 outcomes from this S&ED. And so these are the areas where the two countries can work together. So they covered a lot of common ground. And for example, the climate change. Last November, they reached a major consensus. Now they would like to build on that success and find areas where they can further cooperate with each other. And so that, for example, they can cooperate with each other in areas which actually have economic significance for both countries. Also for new topics, issues like oceans, to protect oceans. Now this is a new issue covered by this dialogue. So the two countries have shared interests in the use and protection of oceans. Of course, they have differences, but they have decided that they can put aside their differences and work on those areas of shared interests.
Jacques, I want to get your thoughts. Do you see it the same way?
A lot of it I do. I mean, I think some of the concrete measures, the specific issues we saw progress on are areas of common ground in an operational sense. And you know, my colleague here just mentioned the key ones, which is climate change, especially the extension of environmental issues now to the oceans. And I would add the initial reports we've got of discussing a code of conduct for cyberspace. You know, that's an important area as well. But I think the bigger picture of areas of commonality are really the shared interests of both countries in dealing with what's a fairly troubled global economy now, as both China and the U.S. pursue their own regional trade agreements, and what is really a quite fraught situation in the South China Sea, where nobody wants conflict, but clearly tensions are higher than they have been. So those are areas of profound common interest. You can add terrorism to that list as well. But they're areas where the approaches are different enough that there's still some work to be done.
Okay, well, you brought up climate change, and then you also brought up the South China Sea, and I think there's a good correlation there, because back in 2013, you had a talk which was titled "Why the Sea is Boiling Hot," of course, talking about the South China Sea. I don't suspect the temperature's gone down that much in 2 years' time. Well, I'm going to ask both of you, where can they meet in the middle, or is this going to be an issue that's always going to be a sticking point between these two countries? And why don't I start with you, Jacques?
Well,
I think it's a long-term.
Jacques,
Yes.
Jacques, let's start with
Sorry.
Jacques this time, and I'll go to Mr. John in just a second.
Well, I mean, I think that you know, at some broad level, there is a common interest in peace and stability in the South China Sea, and both sides have expressed a commitment to free navigation and obeying rules of international law and so on. So there is, at least at some broad level, some shared interests and approaches there. But it's going to be a long-term sticking point. I mean, the U.S. has been made clear at the Shangri-La dialogue and in other contexts is quite concerned about the land reclamation. And I think you have a real conflict of interpretations here. The Chinese view is that China is simply protecting and safeguarding its sovereignty over areas that it claims from what it sees as encroachments by neighboring states trying to assert their contesting claims to rights. And the U.S. sees Chinese behavior as a threat to some extent to U.S. allies and friends in the region, but more importantly in some ways to principles of free access to the sea lanes and air lanes and the kind of operation that the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet and U.S. military forces have long engaged in, and engaged in a way that China has found offensive by parking on China's doorstep and doing close-in surveillance. So we've got some pretty basic differences of agreement about what the rules of the road and who has what rights in that area are. I don't see it going away soon, but I don't see it intentionally escalating into a major superpower conflict.
Well, Mr. John, let me kind of piggyback off what he just said. I was having dinner with a Chinese friend on Friday, and he says, you know, the U.S. is just bullying China. That's the perception, this containment perception. What about the perceptions? One side has one perception, the other has another.
Well, certainly the two countries will maintain their differences over the South China Sea, because they have different interests for that. For China, it's kind of sovereignty issue. China is going to defend its sovereignty no matter what position the United States takes and will take, and also will seek a peaceful kind of solution to the disputes over the islands in the South China Sea. And for the United States, it says it would like to maintain a free freedom of navigation, but the freedom of navigation is not a problem and has never been a problem. So for China, many people here question the intention behind the U.S. repeated mention of the freedom navigation. And for the two countries, it's good. It will be constructive for the United States not to take sides in the dispute in the South China Sea and works with China for the maintenance of stability there.
Why don't we stay there in Beijing? I've got another follow-up question for you. How does this set the stage for President Xi's state visit in September here in Washington?
President Xi's visit to the United States is very significant. And actually, it is the first state visit by the president, although he spent 2 days in California in 2013 with an informal meeting with President Obama, which was very important, actually set the tone for the development of the bilateral relations in the past 2 years. And if President Xi has an opportunity to visit the United States again, it may be another 5 or 6 years, if history can tell us. And so the current dialogue actually help decide and identify key areas of cooperation which the two countries can work on, and they're trying to manage the differences between them, which have been cropping up in the past few months. So actually, the current dialogue has improved atmosphere for the future visit by President Xi Jinping, and also let people know that yes, indeed, China and the United States do have many areas of shared interests, and they can work on many key areas which are both vital to both nations and the world.
Jacques, I'll let you answer the question as well. You see this as a significant building block in order to make it a smoother state visit for President Xi?
Well, I think it helps. One of the things that's happened with the strategic and economic dialogue is it often is sort of a table setting or a foundation laying moment for something that is a deliverable that comes through later. We saw this in the last S&ED a year ago when not a whole lot seemed to happen concretely at the S&ED, but it was followed by the big deal climate change agreement. So there may be the hope that some kind of deliverable like that will come out of President Xi's state visit. People talk about the bilateral investment treaty perhaps, but I think there's still too many issues to be dealt with there. But I think the tone of the S&ED was generally positive, and I think was positive against the baseline of the tensions that have been bubbling up in the relationship recently. And I think a lot of sides want to see it successful. Obviously, President Xi would like a successful visit, and I think President Obama would like a successful kind of last state visit by President Xi. And I think in Washington and in the U.S. in general, there is a concern about the generally negative drift in the relationship or the perception of the relationship. And although this is not an occasion for a reset, it is perhaps an occasion for putting a more positive face on it and using the occasion of a state visit to push forward on areas where there can be collaboration. That said, the irritants are definitely there. We saw them at the S&ED, and it's not going to be possible, or I think even desirable, to keep them off the table at the summit.
All right, gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us and giving us your assessment from Beijing and Philadelphia. Appreciate it.